Most men think the argument is about scrambled eggs. It's not. What gets framed as domestic labor distribution or gender role enforcement is actually a negotiation table where neither party admits they're trading. And the argument always starts in the wrong place, with the task itself, instead of what made the task necessary. I'm going to walk through this without softening it, because the pattern isn't complicated. It's just uncomfortable. Here's what I see repeated. A woman who doesn't work, doesn't have young children, lives in a home paid for almost entirely by someone else, and she presents the question of whether she should prepare breakfast as if it's a matter of principle. It's not principle. It's accounting. And the accounting only gets confusing when one side refuses to name what they're contributing. Let me be specific about what I mean by contribution, because this is where most people stop thinking clearly. If you're home, if your day is structured around yourself, if the reason you can wake at 9 instead of 6 is because someone else is already gone by then, working in a building they didn't choose, doing tasks they didn't design, so that rent gets paid, and utilities stay on, and food appears in the refrigerator, then your day is not actually yours. It's subsidized. That doesn't mean you owe servitude. It means you owe reciprocity. And reciprocity doesn't announce itself with moral language. It just shows up, or it doesn't. Now, the part that makes people uncomfortable is this. Preparing a meal for someone who funds your ability not to work is not oppression. It's exchange. And if you refuse the exchange while keeping the funding, you're not standing on principle. You're just taking. That's the first layer. But let's go further, because there's a second pattern layered on top of the first one, and this one is harder to see because it hides behind exaggeration. The claim that domestic tasks are unbearably difficult. I need to be direct here. If you have a washing machine, a dryer, a dishwasher, a vacuum cleaner, and a stove, then approximately 60% of what used to be physically exhausting labor has been automated. What remains is coordination and time, not suffering. Time. Cooking for 2 people does not require daily effort if you're willing to make food that lasts more than one meal. Laundry for 2 people does not require daily effort unless you're changing clothes 3 times a day. Cleaning for 2 people does not require daily effort unless you're treating normal living like a contamination event. I know this because I do it. And I don't do it alone. Most people who live with another adult and no children do it without collapsing from exhaustion. So when I hear someone describe basic household maintenance as if it's equivalent to physical labor in a field or a factory, I don't hear accuracy, I hear performance. And the performance has a function. It inflates the value of tasks that are being used as justification for not doing other tasks. Here's why that matters. If you're claiming exhaustion to avoid preparing a meal for someone who leaves at dawn to work all day, but you're not too exhausted to spend 3 hours on your phone, or meet a friend for coffee, or scroll through someone else's life updates, then the exhaustion is selective. And selective exhaustion is just refusal with better branding. That's not an attack, it's a description. Because what I'm watching happen is a shift in how women are narrating domestic contribution. And the narration now includes an idea that didn't used to be there. That preparing food or maintaining a shared space is degrading unless it's financially compensated or ideologically voluntary. But that logic only works if you ignore what's already being compensated. If someone else is covering your cost of living, you are being compensated. You're just not calling it that. And the reason you're not calling it that is because once you name it, the argument changes. It stops being about equality and starts being about fairness. And fairness asks a different question. Are you contributing proportionally to what you're receiving? If the answer is no, if you're being fully supported and contributing minimally, then the refusal to prepare breakfast isn't a feminist stance. It's just imbalance dressed up as autonomy. Now let's address the exception, because there is one, and it's not symbolic. If there is a newborn in the house, everything I just said stops applying. Newborns don't sleep in cycles that allow recovery. They wake every 2 to 3 hours. They need to be fed, held, changed, soothed. This continues around the clock. It continues for months, and it doesn't pause because you're tired, or because you've already woken up 4 times, or because your body is still recovering from giving birth. I've seen this up close. I grew up in a house where a sibling was born when I was old enough to be aware of what it meant. The entire household lost sleep. The entire household heard the crying. The entire household adjusted. But the person doing the feeding, the holding, the changing, that person was operating on a level of fatigue that most people never experience unless they've been through it. So if someone has just given birth, or is managing an infant who isn't sleeping, or is dealing with colic or feeding complications or postpartum recovery, then no, household tasks are not their responsibility by default. And anyone who argues otherwise doesn't understand what sustained sleep deprivation does to a person. That's the exception. It's real. It's significant. And it changes the entire structure of who should be doing what. But outside of that, outside of newborns, outside of medical recovery, outside of circumstances that genuinely prevent function, the argument returns to the same place. Are you contributing in proportion to what you're receiving? And here's where the second exception comes in. If both people are working, if both people are contributing financially in a way that's relatively equal, if rent is split, bills are split, effort is split, then yes, household tasks should also be split, not symbolically. Actually, that means if you both leave for work at similar times, then whoever gets home first starts dinner. It means if one person is consistently covering more of the financial load, the other person should be covering more of the domestic load. It means you don't get to claim equality in one direction and reject it in the other. You don't get to say, I shouldn't have to cook because I'm not his servant, while also saying he should pay for most of the rent because he earns more. Pick one framework, egalitarian or transactional, but don't switch between them depending on which one benefits you in the moment, because that's not equality. That's just strategic positioning. And men notice. They don't always say it clearly. They don't always have the language for it, but they notice when the logic shifts depending on the context. And once they notice, they stop interpreting your refusal as independence. They start interpreting it as unwillingness. And unwillingness, over time, becomes something else. It becomes the quiet recognition that the person they're with doesn't actually see the relationship as reciprocal. They see it as something they're owed. That recognition doesn't usually announce itself. It just shifts how effort is allocated going forward. Let me make one more thing clear, because this comes up constantly and it's always misunderstood. When I say a woman should prepare breakfast for her partner under certain conditions, I'm not saying she's required to. I'm not saying it's biological destiny. I'm not saying she has no choice. I'm saying it's intelligent. It's intelligent because small acts of care, when they're proportional and reciprocal, create relational stability. They signal investment. They signal that you see the other person's effort and you're matching it. And the absence of those acts, especially when the other person is covering most of the material responsibility, signals the opposite. It signals that you're willing to receive but not return, and that signal is read correctly. Which brings me to the final point, and this is the one that gets the most resistance. The question of whether a woman should prepare breakfast for her partner is not actually about breakfast. It's about whether she understands that relationships are built on exchange, not entitlement. And the women who are most offended by that sentence are usually the ones who've been operating on entitlement for long enough that they've stopped noticing it. They'll tell you they're not being cared for. They'll tell you they're exhausted. They'll tell you they're undervalued. But if you look at the actual distribution of effort, of financial responsibility, of who's structuring their life around the relationship and who's structuring the relationship around their convenience, the story changes. And once the story changes, the question of breakfast stops being theoretical. It becomes diagnostic. If you're refusing to prepare a meal for someone who makes your life materially possible, you're not asserting your equality. You're testing whether they'll tolerate imbalance. And eventually, they won't. Not because they stopped loving you, but because they stopped believing the relationship was mutual. That belief doesn't reset. It just quietly recalibrates. And once it does, everything that felt optional starts feeling like evidence.